notice how the oligarchy and the plutocracy, whatever you want to call it, blocks the people from their constitutional avenues of reflecting their sovereignty, as is in the preamble to the Constitution, we the people. Notice, you cannot use the courts to challenge criminal illegality abroad by our government officials and their corporate contractors, because the judges will say, you have no standing to sue, you can't get into the court to even plead your case, and besides, these are political questions outside the federal court's jurisdiction. So the courts are blocked. Number two, you can't use the Congress because a majority of the Congress rolls over for the executive branch, as they have been increasingly violating their own oath of office to represent their constitutional authority to declare war or not to declare war. There are some, as you know, there are some members of Congress who are stand up, like Dennis Kucinich, John Conyers, and others, but they are still a minority, and we owe it to them to support them very strongly back home. Now, because what they're going to start to do is what Congress did in the 1970s when Nixon was president. They cut off funds for continuing the war in Vietnam and provided funds for bringing our soldiers back. That's the authority Congress has to stop this expanding military disaster in Afghanistan spilling over into Pakistan. Now let's see, what kind of access do we have to the White House? That's the third branch of government. Do any of us have access to the White House? You know who has access to the White House? The CEO bosses of Aetna, the CEO bosses of the drug companies, of the munitions corporations, of what Eisenhower warned us about in his farewell address, the CEOs who run the military-industrial complex. They get invited to the White House, they meet with the White House, but the people who elected Barack Obama, they are persona non grata. So we are blocked from all three branches of government. How about the media? Now check this out. FAIR, the organization FAIR, writing in the magazine Extra, analyzed the op-ed pages of the New York Times and Washington Post from January to October 30 of this year. In the Washington Post alone, 61 out of 67 op-eds supported continuation of the war in Afghanistan. And this is supposed to be a liberal paper. So basically, the voice of a majority of people in this country, many retired military, diplomatic, and national security officials, the voice of many academics who have studied this problem over there, are shut out, essentially shut out of the media. And you can imagine what the national TV news is all about. Now, there is the question here of finding the people who have great credibility because they come from the military and the diplomats and the national security. And it's quite interesting to note that you are able to use the statements of many prominent people, which I haven't found being used too much in the anti-war literature. For example, Matthew Ho, this captain, combat captain, stated, and he was over there and he was right in the middle of it as a Foreign Service officer. He said, quote, "The bulk of the insurgency fights against the presence of foreign soldiers and taxes imposed by an unrepresented, corrupt government in Kabul." In other words, why are we over there? Obama says we want to destroy Al-Qaeda. But his own national security advisor says there's at the most 100 Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And they have no base, no artillery, no army, no navy, nothing. They can't attack the Allies or the U.S. military, according to Jim Jones, right here at the White House, the national security advisor. So who are we fighting? Well, now Obama says we're fighting the Taliban, and he stereotypes the Taliban as if they're all engaged in supporting Al-Qaeda, which is, of course, not true. And what we're seeing here is the natural resistance movement to foreign occupation, something that we would do with great energy if foreigners occupied our soil. There's also George Bush and Barack Obama, a seamless transition when it comes to Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, what we have to ask ourselves, and by the way, do you know what this war is costing in a micro sense? Listen to this. You know what a gallon of gasoline delivered to the mountains of eastern Afghanistan to our soldiers is costing the taxpayer? $400 a gallon. $400 a gallon. Now,
who's profiting?
Yes. Now, another thing that's important to note here is the statement by a very respected former CIA guy who's been speaking out here, and basically what he says is that the resistance in Afghanistan is a resistance against foreign occupation. That to the extent they're supporting the Taliban fighters is because they're the only effective fighters in the country. The other thing that Obama doesn't clarify with all his reputed intelligence is that the Afghan army is made up of northern tribes, Uzbeks and Tajiks, who are loathed by the southern and southeastern giant tribe Pashtuns, which are made up of 40 million people. So you have intertribal conflict, which is stimulated dramatically by the foreign occupation. Now, what do we do here? Well, one, we have to say that the escalation in Afghanistan is fueling the insurgency. So you don't want to put gasoline on fire. You want to withdraw the fighters, and you want to represent the best hand of the United States, having destroyed so much of that country, which is what Ashraf Ghani, the former finance minister, the honest finance minister of Afghanistan, former president of Kabul University, former professor of anthropology in the U.S., said concrete justice. Concrete justice is working with the tribal leaders and give them a stake in providing for their people, and it's much cheaper than having soldiers at $1 million a year there, providing people with jobs, agriculture, schools, clinics, highways, all the things that are needed for a decent livelihood. That is what will end the kind of conflict that we are expanding in terms of more and more soldiers. Now, Obama hasn't talked much about negotiations, but the untold secret in Afghanistan is that the British, the Dutch, the French, and the U.S. have been in direct contact with various groups of Taliban. Been in direct contact. You see, if they tell you that, they will break the stereotype of characterizing the Taliban as just a bunch of terrorists. But they have been in direct contact, and the British, for example, want direct negotiations, and the French want direct negotiations, as has been the case in some quarters in the U.S. Now, Obama believes that people of your persuasion, namely the majority of the American people, have nowhere to go politically. That's why he can ignore us. And of course, the answer has to be that in the congressional elections of 2010, people do have where to go. They can go for third-party candidates, or they can stay home. And just let me end on this note. Remember, our ambassador to Afghanistan sent cables to the State Department a few weeks ago saying, don't send more soldiers because the Afghan government is not really a government. It's unstable and it's corrupt and it doesn't deliver services, etc. Well, you notice how Ambassador Eikenberry testified the other day? They brought him right back into the fold. But that didn't deny his candid appraisal there, and he's a former general to boot. Now, remember 1994, when a lot of Democrats and a lot of liberals stayed home. Gingrich toppled the Democrats in Congress and took control of Congress in January 1995. That can happen again if Obama continues his reckless path toward a criminal war of aggression that is undermining our national security, our national reputation, and destroying on both sides of the ocean millions of innocent people's lives, health, safety, and hopes for the future. Thank you very much.